So I want to say thank you to each and every one of you for the many ways you support West Texas A&M University, certainly for your financial contributions, but more importantly, maybe through your engagement with this university through events like this evening. That's why we're here, certainly to fulfill our educational mission, not only to our students, but to the community that we serve as well. And so we're very pleased that you're here this evening to join us on the campus. Thank you to our speaker for coming to join us here in the Panhandle. And I want to thank Dr. Hunt for his leadership with the center and for what he does here at the university and well. And I'd like to introduce now Dr. Alex Hunt.
Thank you, Todd. Good evening, welcome, and thank you all for being here in person and on Zoom. So we have quite a few on Zoom tonight. If you're here in the hall, please do take a moment to silence your cell phones, just while I'm thinking of that. Thank you for that. And also, so I don't forget, let me go ahead and just quickly thank some of our supporters. Our lecture tonight is supported by WT's Distinguished Lecture Series, as well as the Departments of History and English, Philosophy, and Modern Languages. So I thank them for their funding support and their energy in helping us get the word out. At CSAW, that is the Center for the Study of the American West, we can claim to be the first on campus to move our events online at the beginning of the pandemic. And tonight is our first major event to be in person, and we are grateful for that. 5 years ago, we launched the Center for the Study of the American West with the first Nall Lecture. And the Nall Lecture, of course, is named after Garry Nall, the wonderful and respected and fondly remembered professor of history here at WT and longtime editor of the Panhandle Plains Historical Review. And he certainly was one of my mentors and one of those who taught me about the history of this region, and I'm very grateful to him. And I'm sorry he couldn't be here tonight with us, although his wife Annette Nall is here tonight, and thank you for that, Annette. So that night 5 years ago featured a historian named Patricia Limerick. Limerick is known as the leader of the New Western historians, who championed historical revision that disrupted the so-called Old Western history that was often a celebration of sort of the frontier mythos. Her most famous book is called Legacies of Conquest, and it emphasized the history of the American West as one of violence and colonization. This kind of history, I think, was a necessary corrective, and we're still working through the implications of that 1987 book for our own region, I think. But for this Nall Lecture, I'm pleased to offer you a somewhat different take on Western history. We've already been joking around about titles because Dr. Aron's book, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press, which is pretty good press, you know, keeps having title changes. And at one point, when we first started talking, it was Legacies of Concord, which alluded to Patricia Limerick's Legacies of Conquest. But then it's become Peace and Friendship, the title of tonight's lecture. But now at the press's request, he's thinking about maybe some other possibilities. So I've been making suggestions. But so maybe as you listen tonight, you know, think of ideas for him. In any case, what intrigues me about Stephen Aron's work is the thought that there might be an alternative way of thinking of the history of the American West that isn't so entirely predicated on frontier violence. And I think that's a conversation very worth having. And I'm curious to see where that's going to go tonight. And in thinking about this, I was in no small way actually thinking of WT's One West's comprehensive campaign, which Todd was just talking about, which seemed to me to be emphasizing both the Westernness of our region, and we really are a Western place, and also this notion that maybe the West could be a unifying idea rather than a dividing idea, which again is not the usual way of thinking about it. We don't have to pretend that our Western past was a campfire sing-along or anything of that sort, but it may be there are some instances of cooperation and shared goals from which we can learn something. Stephen Aron had an impressive career at the University of California at Los Angeles, a period during which he published books, including How the West Was Lost, American Confluence, Frontiers, Borderlands, Wests, and The American West, A Very Short Introduction, among other things, and a number of very influential articles on, among other things, the conceptual frameworks of borderlands history. But he also accepted a dual appointment in his career with the Autry Museum of the American West, where for some years he engaged in a different kind of scholarly work, that of being a museum professional or public historian, bringing the American West to the general public through museum exhibits and programs. That's a very different kind of historical work than that of being a history professor, for certain. And that was a large part of what led me to inviting him to come out and speak. And very recently, Dr. Aron retired from UCLA, still a very youthful man, I might add, to accept the position of president and CEO of the Autry. A bold move, I think, at a time when museums are struggling, even before the pandemic, to draw a public that's increasingly engaged with its screens, right? A lot of competition out there. And this was another reason, again, that Stephen Aron struck me as an excellent choice for this year's Nall Lecture, as we celebrate 100 years of the Panhandle Plains Historical Society and think about the importance of that institution to us here in the Panhandle and on campus of West Texas A&M University. Simply put, CSAW, the Center for the Study of the American West, exists primarily as a bridge between WT's academic mission and the museum's public outreach. CSAW asks, how can we take all the expertise and information and artifacts and documents that we have on hand and make it useful for our region and for the greater West? I think that Stephen Aron, with his background as a scholar, an academic, and museum professional, can help us a great deal in thinking about that. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Aron to West Texas A&M University.
Thank you very much for probably the last introduction that I will ever be described as youthful again. And I would say, though, that I've been in the role now as president and CEO at the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles for 3 months now. Perhaps my hair was not quite as gray as it is now before I started, when I left the professorial world for the world of museum leadership. It has certainly brought some new challenges, or as I say, every day is a new adventure in the museum world. But I'm really honored to be invited here and to have the opportunity to speak to those of you who are here in the audience and those of you out in the Zoom world about a book I've been working on for a number of years that, as Alex said in his, Dr. Hunt said in his opening remarks, has gone under a number of title changes, and perhaps by the end of this evening, it'll have a new one. Over dinner, Dr. Hunt suggested Frontier Frenemies, which I'm a sucker for alliteration, so I may go down that path, but I'm not sure that the people at Oxford University Press will go for that. We'll go that direction. But in some ways, just to sort of set up that book, let me make sure I can get this to work right. I think I'm hitting the correct button here. Next slide there. There we go. There we go. So in many ways, I think of the book that I'm writing now, which, as I say, carries an uncertain first part of the title, but I know the second part of the title is an alternative history of the American West. And I mean it as a kind of counterpoint and counterpart to this book that I wrote a few years ago that was an effort. It's part of a series that also Oxford University Press does. And mine was on the American West, a very short introduction. And maybe you've seen these books. They're often in airport bookstores. And I sometimes have thought of them as sort of because you're strictly limited, no matter what your subject is, to 35,000 words. So I sometimes think of it as 35,000 words for people at 35,000 feet to read, because it was sort of, I think, one idea of the series was that it would be the sort of book that you could take on an airplane, and in a couple of hours ride on the other side, you could have some basic cocktail party familiarity with the subject. And I mean, there are, I think, maybe 400 or 500 books in this series now on all manner of subject. But I have to confess that when I wrote the book, I think my first draft came in at like 70,000 words. And they came back to me and said, no, it's 35,000 words. And I said, well, surely I deserve more than 35,000 words, because after all, the American West is a big subject. And what's more, I'm not just talking about the American West, I'm talking about the whole continent as a once West. And what's more, I'm going back to, thousands of years to take the West before it was American and before it was a West. And so surely that means I deserve more. And in fact, I looked at some of the other titles in the series and I found this one. And I said to the editor, who's also the editor of my new book, and I said, look, surely that book has some leftover words to lend me, because how much can you say about nothing? And then I came across this book, or they retorted with this book, which I suppose, their suggestion was, if you could distill the meaning of life into 35,000 words, then surely the American West could also be pared down to 35,000 words. So that was an argument I lost. Sort of take up what I call this, and I'm going to talk more about what I mean by this idea of an alternative history of the American West. But the title, at least as of this morning, remained Peace and Friendship. And that title comes from the medals that American emissaries gave usually to Indians as a sort of regular feature of American diplomacy between agents of the United States and Indian peoples. And oftentimes, on the flip side of these medals was the bust of the then reigning president. And it really starts with George Washington. This is a version, actually, that if I had shown you the flip sides from the Archer collections, it's one of the medals that Lewis and Clark carry with them. And on the other side is Thomas Jefferson's bust. But here it is, Peace and Friendship. And then you can see the clasped hands, one of an American soldier and one of an Indian leader with the gauntlet, and then the pipe and the tomahawk, and then these words, peace and friendship, inscribed on the medal. And as I say, this was a feature of American diplomacy with Indians, really from the beginnings of the American Republic, and through the 1870s. They continued to give out these peace medals. And I sort of was struck by that phrase, peace and friendship, because I think, as Alex said in his opening introductory remarks, neither peace nor friendship are words that we readily associate with the history of the American frontier or with the history of the American West more broadly. Indeed, what would histories of westward expansion be without westward expansion of the United States be without their famous battles and infamous massacres? What would Westerns, as a cinematic genre, what would Westerns be without their clashes of civilization and savagery, or their climactic gunfights? Even, and again, going back to Alex's introductory remarks, where he talked about the shift in Western history, and I would argue in Westerns, and what Patty Limerick's work and her lecture here several years ago highlighted, that shift, even as Western history has really inverted its perspectives in some way, has upended the old Western history verities, even then, what I think has remained central to Western history in both its older distillation and its new, central also to Westerns as a cinematic genre, would be the centrality of violence and bloodshed. The difference being, I suppose, that what was once celebrated for making America great, what was once celebrated for manifesting the destiny of the United States, has in more recent years in the new Western history flip been castigated for enabling the expansion of the United States. Indeed, as one looks at the other sort of peace and friendship as I say, don't figure in either of these histories much, that in fact, as Patricia Limerick's book, Legacy of Conquest, established conquest as the new sort of paradigm, the new ruling paradigm in Western history. And the other, I think, buzzwords that have come to define the study of the frontier and Western past, typically, or frontier, borderland, and Western past, now have been empire, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, and even genocide. A sharp contrast with an older literature that I think tended to speak of westward expansion in terms of social progress, political democracy, economic development. But as I said, rather in common, older and Western histories have, as I say, a feature that there was little peace and very little friendship between Americans and Indians that defined that frontier history of the United States. So I have to say, when I've told people over the years that I'm writing this book about peace and friendship in this, in this framework, or Legacies of Concord, or what was once called Can We All Get Along as a title, most people then say, oh, you must be writing another very short book. But that is not the case. In fact, weighing in at 110,000 words, Peace and Friendship, or whatever the title may one day be, is not a very short introduction, not a very short book at all. And my argument is that dark and bloody, as American frontiers often were, my book finds sites and situations in which colonialism wore a different face, and relations between Indians, settlers, and states deviated for a time from the monolithic logic of elimination and exclusive occupation. The episodes that I highlight in my book provide evidence of barriers breached and accords reached, of erstwhile enemies overcoming their differences, of would-be combatants standing down. Peace and Friendship presents what I call an alternative history of the American West, a subtitle that I fully expect may confuse many readers. Traversing American frontiers from the Appalachians to the Pacific, and from the birth of the United States through the first century of the American Republic, each chapter focuses on a particular locale in which foes faced off against one another. Now, there's nothing particularly alternative about that formulation. But in these cases that I highlight, violence was contained. The book's contents explore how amicable relations unexpectedly developed at these sites. And here's an important, though, caveat. How amicable relations developed, how frontier frenemies became part of the equation, but how those relations collapsed. And try to explain how and why they collapsed. That is this, I think, is an alternative history that we've too often forgotten or misremembered, leaving for my book to plumb the record of Concord and try to understand its lessons for us today. Now, the reason why I said I expected my title might confuse people is that, I should sort of stop and explain a little bit what I mean by alternative history as a genre, because I think many people, in fact, if you Google the term alternative history, which you can do right now, if you Google the term alternative history, you'll find that the link will automatically take you to alternate history. That is to say, Google conflates alternative history and alternate history as one and the same. It automatically directs you. And if you click on the link for alternate history, then you get taken to some books like this one, in which historical outcomes have been altered. The most numerous of these books in the genre of alternate history are, guess what subject is probably the most done? Not Western history. There are two subjects that dominate this literature. World War II, How the Nazis Won the Second World War is a big one, with The Man in the High Castle being the most recent sort of version of that on television. And the other subject? the Civil War and how the South wins the Civil War. But Western history is not left out of the genre. In fact, you can find scores of titles, such as this one, The Indians Won by Martin Smith. And I love this little, more than just a fantasy, America with one incredibly possible, compelling twist. Well, when you read the book, I'm not sure how incredibly possible this twist was. That leads to basically an Indian republic being set up in the middle of North America, and the United States being bifurcated because the Indians win some significant battles. I'm not sure. Anyway, that one doesn't really work very well. Nor does the other most popular topic in this genre of alternate Western history, which are various versions of George Armstrong Custer. You know, as I say, taking the same starting point, there's, you know, in The Indians Won, Custer gets defeated at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and somehow that leads to the unraveling of the United States and this creation of an Indian nation in the middle of the continent. In this one, which actually was made into a television movie, which I haven't been able to find anywhere, but if anyone knows where, I'd love to see it. On NBC, as you see, this one in which Custer survives the Battle of Little Bighorn and gets court-martialed afterwards, and it follows that trial of the century, as it's described. Western outlaws are also a popular topic of these sort of alternate histories. In fact, I just read one recently for someone who had sent it to me. This one, which I even blurb, even though as a historical reconstruction, I'm not sure. It has Billy the Kid surviving into old age and becoming a dentist in Colorado Springs until he decides that he has to take up his guns again to fight against bootleggers in the era of Prohibition. So my point here is that, you know, this can make for entertaining reading, but I think its relationship to history is somewhat problematic. Indeed, I sort of liken it to, and we were talking about this earlier today, about Quentin Tarantino films, which can, you know, elegantly and elegiacally recapture certain times and places. But again, I don't think many historians would mistake this for history. More respectable, I suppose, in academic circles are what are called counterfactual speculation, a fancy name that has sometimes engaged professional historians. And these are also kind of what I would call what-if exercises. In these what-if exercises, scholars have sought to emphasize historical contingencies by focusing on pivotal moments and accenting how uncertain were the choices that produce particular outcomes. And I think that's actually a viable, interesting subject for scholars to do. And where you just plausibly shift one or another topic and then see what kind of outcomes might happen. And there were actually a field that had a sort of fluorescence in the 1970s and 80s when quantitative history was particularly in vogue. Pliometricians, fancy name for economic historians who manipulated numbers, they really played this game of counterfactual speculation in various ways to sort of explore alternative possibilities in the past, or alternate possibilities. But the fact is, few academic historians, including few who study the American West, pursue counterfactuals very far. Counterfactuals, suggested Adam Grubnick in an article I found in a recent issue of the New Yorker, quote, belong on lunch counters where people can debate them for meaningless hours or at meaningless leisure. That's generally, I think, where historians have left them, sending more often, I think, in our books and even maybe sometimes in lectures to classes, tending to raise these possibilities rather than follow alternate paths. Now, I should say, and this is where I want to make really clear what I'm doing, how it's distinctive from this alternate genre of history. I am not interested in alternate history in that sense. I'm not interested in altering facts. I'm not interested, for that matter, in alternative facts. Although the search engine conflates alternate history and alternative history, the adjectives have distinct meanings. Alternate, among other things, means recurring in turns or serving in place of another. By contrast, alternative connotes a choice between two or more things or existing outside the mainstream. And it's really that meaning that I'm picking up on, the idea of a history outside the mainstream. And it's that, as I say, that second definition that really applies to my understanding of alternative history. The history in my alternative history happened. It's not a fiction. It requires no what ifs to set in motion. And here, as I say, this is just the occurring in turn, serving in place of another existing outside the mainstream. What if? I think alternate history is really a what if genre, whereas mine is really what happened. It's just a what happened sort of outside the mainstream of what we think of in this case as Western American history. And I should say, to be sure, the episodes that I focus on lace together the peace and friendship that happened on American frontiers was often unstable. Local arrangements that curtailed violence gave way when balances of power or powerlessness tipped. The intervention, this is actually an important point that I want to come back to, the interventions and arsenals of empires and nation states, though premised on enforcing or bringing law and order to frontiers, and indeed I have to note the statue of Mr. Goodnight, and one of the things he's credited with on the statue is sort of bringing law and order to this Hobbesian frontier. That's often the way in which these frontier histories are written and frontier heroes are depicted. I would argue, in my own experience, my own book suggests that in fact the interventions of the forces of the state, of armies and bureaucracies of nations and empires often undermined fragile local arrangements, that they often brought in and introduced mechanisms to escalate conflicts that otherwise were more contained and localized. But that's a point that we can return to later. I think in the book, I do sort of highlight what I see as the fragility of conciliations and reconciliations, and show how susceptible these moments and places were to being lost or to being forgotten or to being erased from our historical memory, or misremembered entirely, or turned, as I say, in different directions. Still, as I say here, I think these episodes in some way open up for us a conversation that lace together to allow us to better understand when, where, and how people pushed aside their enmities, why these moments occurred yet did not endure, and what we might take away from the legacies of broken concord. Now, in some ways here, and this is again why the book is no longer called Legacies of Concord, at least for the moment, Alex, because I don't mean to sort of position my book as a sort of antithesis to patricial limericks or as some answer to it. And in fact, I don't see, on the one hand, I think we see conflict and concord as existing as opposition to one another, almost as existing on a separate historical plane. But in fact, I think as I describe in the episodes in my book, oftentimes the movement across this spectrum is pretty quick. And that in many ways, I've tried to reframe my alternative history. One way to think about it would be to see it as an adjacent history of the frontier, an adjacent history of westward expansion, in which this alternative track exists in parallel and oftentimes entangled with the more violent history, and the spectrum runs back and forth. As I say, they don't, the one conflict or conquest emphasizes people, or I should say, concord seems to emphasize people dealing with one another. Conquest has them stealing from one another. The one features fortunate amalgamations, the other forced assimilations. The one glimpses better times, the other exposes trails of bitter tears. But as I said, I think it's useful not to see them as existing entirely separate from one another. My alternative history and what we think of as mainstream history really are in conversation and dialogue with one another, and the movement is back and forth. Indeed, I would argue that the currents of current scholarship, the currents of mainstream history, do not divide so readily between, so cleanly between, quote, the mainstream and my alternative history. While alternate histories push us into parallel dimensions, which those of us of a certain age would sort of think of as sort of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone version of history. The alternative history that I am interested in does not exist so separately. It runs alongside the mainstream, revealing an adjacent or contiguous face of frontier relations. It's not then a story of worlds apart in which histories of concord and conflict sort of exist entirely away from one another. Instead, they should be seen as playing out along an adjacent spectrum. At different moments on the same timeline, often quite proximate, I find examples of relations moving back and forth from one end of the spectrum to the other, of people trading with former foes in one instance and raiding them in another, of convergences coalesced and conversions coerced, of peace between empires, nations, families, and communities brokered and broken. The shifts then mean that the common ground that I find, the common ground found, was often lost. Accordingly, in the case studies that make up my alternative histories table of contents, accommodations were tenuous. Peaceful coexistences were generally temporary. Concord could be heralded, but it rarely held. Now, this recognition of the tenuous nature of my sort of accommodations brings me to another genre that I'm interested, which I call wishtory. And that recognition, as I say, of the tenuousness derives from a subset of, I think of wishtory in some ways as a subset of alternate history. Now, I have to say, I confess to some pride in coining that term, wishtory, until I discovered in 2008, Sears, or 2009, Sears put together an ad campaign with that theme of wishtory. Sigh. But I would say that the way Sears employed, and you can Google this one when you get home, the way Sears deployed, and they used the actress singer Vanessa Hudgens, fresh then from starring in Disney's High School Musical, to peddle Christmas gifts in what they called an American wishtory. But its usage was obviously, I hope, quite different than mine. Wishtory, as I see it, tells us stories about the past, but fictionalizes them in ways that cater to contemporary yearnings. It's the history we wish for and how that's changed over time. As with other alternate histories, wishtories are untethered from what actually happened. And I suppose it's fitting that Sears chose a Disney star for its campaign. For Disney, it seems to me, has long been a leading purveyor of wishtories. Not that long ago, Western histories, or wishtories in the form of Westerns, presented one version of that once upon a time story, Westerns that really reigned on screens for a good part of the 20th century, in which the genre, as we know, neatly divided good gunfighters from bad, and the triumph of the former ennobled, I should say, the violence that won the West. These, I think we can now understand, were wishtories of a past age. Today's wishtories, and I suggested this for those of you who are at some of the students who are here at the 3 p.m., the ways in which I think our wishtories have shifted, and the way I tested this was, I would ask my students, and the ones who are at lunch don't answer, even though the slide's giving it away already. When I would ask my students 30 years ago about which Indian figures popped first to mind, 30 or 40 years ago, when I started teaching 30 plus years ago, they would come back with Sitting Bull or Geronimo, Crazy Horse, and generally, figures associated with militant resistance to American expansionism. By contrast, in recent years, and here the giveaway from the sort of John Wayne to Disney's Pocahontas being one sort of historical figure that has sort of emerged as the sort of central in the American popular imagery. And then the other really being especially prominent during the Lewis and Clark bicentennial expedition a decade or more ago, Sacagawea. And it sort of fascinates me to think about not so much the history that's revealed here, but what it tells us about us and our yearnings that Pocahontas and Sacagawea have sort of emerged to this degree of prominence in kind of popular reckonings about frontier. And what it says to us, the shift sort of in gender from militant male resistance leaders to female figures, girls really, who we associate with frontier origin stories in which people get along, in which they broker intercultural accommodations, in which they marry Euro-American men, in which they bear interracial offspring, in which they give us, in contrast with that kind of feel guilty version of Western history that has, I think, come to the fore in new Western history circles, in which they give us a new feel good origin story for westward expansion, for Western history, whether Disney's Pocahontas or Sacagawea, as rendered here on a US postage stamp, since we actually have no idea from any of the journals what Sacagawea looked like. In any case, that sort of just fascinates me in a separate way about how what this, as I say, says about changing wishtory, if not about changing history. One of the features I think also about wishtory is that they almost always feature happily ever after kind of illusions. Whereas again, I would argue that my alternative history is certainly not, to go back to the campfire, I think you used this in the introduction, the sort of metaphor of singing alongs by the campfire stories. That's not, mine is not a kumbaya history, to use that one. It's not about people getting along in that way, or it's not really about happily ever after either. And yet, as I said, and when I sort of think about the table of contents of the book, I'm looking at places where I think we don't expect, we don't think of places where violence was in any way contained. And yet I'm looking at those arrangements and accommodations that allowed that to happen. And I think I have enough time to sort of very, very briefly try to distill some of my understandings here about these sites and how they fit in my alternative framework, and how they, I should say, I hope, open up a conversation on these lines. Because look, I want to be careful here. I deliberately titled the book, or subtitled the book, not just alternative history to confuse my readers, but an alternative. I don't say the, I say an alternative history. And I think that difference is critical to me, because I'm not in any way suggesting that I've done anything comprehensive, encyclopedic. I've not in any way attempted. I'm rather trying to tell stories that I indeed try to thread together in a narrative that, as I say, laces together, that these episodes link together in various ways. But I don't in any way claim to have covered them all that are possible. And indeed, what I hope is that my book starts a conversation about these episodes and how they help us rethink some of the paradigms we attach to the frontier history of the United States, to frontier relations, and that they encourage others to search out similar situations, or to search out similar situations that might also fit within my frontier frenemy framework. How's that, Alex? And think about the ways in which they might also help us understand lessons we might take away. And so let me just spend, I guess, a few minutes here talking about some of the lessons and how they fit together. Now, my first chapter, as I say, starts in Chillicothe, an Indian village, not to be confused with the Chillicothe that exists in Ohio today. The Indian villages probably that I'm interested in, there were many Indian villages, Shawnee Indian villages with that name. Chillicothe, it's a Shawnee Indian village, but it's really a multi-ethnic Indian village. I particularly interested in the moment in 1778 when Daniel Boone, is taken captive by Shawnees and brought to Chillicothe, and where he spends several months as an adopted member of the Shawnee Indian Nation. And I'm particularly interested in Boone's flirtation with his Shawnee captors and with Shawnee culture, and with his ambivalence about whether to return or not, and what lessons that happens, and how it was that Boone in particular, and this he features prominently in both chapters 1 and 2, how it was that Boone in particular was able to overcome his enmities. And it really traces back, one of the things that Boone once said, which I find a fascinating line, is at one point he says to his Shawnee captors and now his adoptive family, quote, "Many things happen in war that were best forgotten in peace." And it's from that dictum that I explore the relations that exist and develop on the revolutionary frontier in the Ohio Valley, and how Boone, as I say, flirts with shifting attachments and shifting loyalties, and how it is, even after he goes back to sort of reclaim his place in Kentucky pioneer society, how it is that he retains these ambivalent national attachments, but also how it is that he is able to forget what happened, and how, and I guess part of why I'm particularly interested in that is, in conventional dictum today, in terms of peace and in terms of truth and reconciliation commissions, for example, that have popped up around the world today, oftentimes the premise is that in order to get beyond the horrors of history, one must reckon with them, one must remember them, one must come to acknowledge them and sort of deal with them. Whereas Boone's philosophy in some ways was the opposite. And it worked for a time, at least for him. And it worked again, as I talk about in chapter 2, and really one of the remarkable episodes of reconciliation, which is this chapter about Apple Creek, which is a place in southeastern Missouri. It's a little creek in southeastern Missouri running north of Cape Girardeau, where many of the same people who had been bitter enemies, fighting each other in some of the darkest and bloodiest of frontier wars during the Revolutionary era and in the decade after the Revolution, both American and Indian refugees resettle in Spanish Louisiana during the 1780s and 1790s, and including Daniel Boone, who accepts an invitation from the Spanish to relocate into Louisiana colony. And here you have what you would expect to be yet another, what you would fully expect to be a renewal of their past enmities. That is, they had been fighting each other for decades for control of the Ohio Valley. These people relocate to the Mississippi Valley, and you expect violence of again on the same scale as in revolutionary Kentucky, Ohio, and yet it doesn't happen during the 1790s. And there I'm sort of asking, why not? How do we explain how these people who had been the bitters, and in fact, the Shawnees, when they relocate, they say we're relocating to escape the Americans who have spread like locusts across our country, and they are our, quote, cruelest enemies. So how is it that cruelest enemies become newest friends in this new setting? And there again, I'm trying to explore what are the conditions that allow people to have overcome those differences. And in that case, I argue that that in fact, particular sets of geopolitical circumstances contribute to how they are able to overcome their enemies. Part of it is to follow Daniel Boone's wisdom and forget what happened in war. But more of it, I think, owes to the ways in which there's a balance of power and numbers. Demography matters a great deal in this argument. When Americans are outnumbered and outgunned, or at least not in control demographically, they tend to be more accommodating. That's part of it. It's also, I think, the weakness of empires and nation states in the area, especially through the 1790s and even into the first decade of the United States rule after the Louisiana Purchase, that the nation as an entity remains weak. And indeed, in the Ohio Valley, what I argue in the first chapter is that for the most part, dark and bloody as some of the raiding is between Indians and American pioneers, it remains relatively contained. It's very small scale raiding until the British Empire, the United States, the new United States revolutionary government, and the state of Virginia bring their arsenals to bear, bring their money and their weaponry to bear, that really weaponizes the conflict and allows what had been small scale contained conflict to become a much larger scale raid. And that pattern repeats itself across other frontiers as well, where local arrangements that contain violence get undermined by the power of those forces claiming to represent law and order. In fact, they often disrupt the peace or disturb the peace. And that's sort of what happens at Apple Creek too. As long as the Spanish remain a very weak power, as long as the United States is distant, as long as Britain is not really there, as long as the Indian powers or the Indian American numbers are relatively equal, as long as they have a common foe, in this case, the Osage Indians, Americans and Shawnees, people who had been cruelest enemies to one another, band together in all sorts of social and economic intercourse, and even intermingling and intermating, and also the presence of a common foe unites them, which is another sort of larger principle I see across many of these situations. In fact, though, and the reason why I sort of argue that these precepts are crucial is because when they fall away, when the United States begins to exercise more dominant power in the region, when the common enemy, the Osages, get pushed out, when the American numbers overwhelm the local Indians, then these good relations, which really had existed for a couple of decades, really fall away, a subject I take up in chapter 4. In between, though, I look at the Lewis and Clark expedition. And in particular, I'm focused on the moment or the winter they spend of 1805, 1806 on the Pacific coast at Fort Clatsop. Now, there are actually many other points of the Lewis and Clark, and I look at the expedition as a whole in the book, but there are many other points, in fact, where I think more peaceful and more friendly relations were established. What fascinates me in part about Fort Clatsop, the winter they spend there, is that that is really a site that has become the focus of the greatest historical attention. That is, in bicentennial commemorations, one of the several of the ones that were most key, that were most often commemorated and celebrated was, well, you know, at the Autry we did, our Native Voices did, for example, our Native Voices Theatrical Company did a play by the Cherokee playwright Diane Glancy about, what was it called? I can't even remember the title of it, but it was boiled down to a 4-character play. It was, now it's just a 3-character play because Lewis and Clark were played by the same schizophrenic individual. And then the others were York and Sacagawea. York, Clark's African-American slave, Sacagawea, the Indian woman who accompanies them. And really that sort of distilled, I think, the feel-good version into this multi-ethnic kumbaya story of the expedition. There was also, I don't know if anyone got to see Lewis and Clark, the opera, that premiered in St. Louis. And actually at the Autry, we also did Lewis and Clark, the musical, which was actually, it had an impressive pedigree. The person who was the person behind it had actually done the Broadway musical 9, had won Tony Awards. And the climactic moment is when they get to Fort Clatsop and Sacagawea gets to sing about going to see the whale, which really didn't make for them. It's probably why you've heard of Hamilton and not heard of Lewis and Clark, the musical now. But Sacagawea gets to see the whale. But the other key moment that has been the focus of so much of our wishtory in recent decades is the vote on which side of the Columbia River they're going to put their fort for the winter. And the fact that they allow both York and Sacagawea to vote as part of they allow all the members of the court to vote on which side to do it on. And the fact that they allow York and Sacagawea to vote is seen as this great glimpse into the democratic possibilities of the American West. In fact, though, that's not what happened. So there's my Daniel Boone slide. I fell behind in my slides here. There's the Lewis and Clark expedition route. And as I say, I'm looking particularly at Fort Clatsop there. And you know, at the relations between Clark and Lewis and what really happens there, which really does not in any way live up to the kind of historical version. And yet, I would argue that the Lewis and Clark expedition also has important meanings for us to think about how they were able to, if not, you know, they constantly lace their speeches with notions about peace and friendship and bringing peace and friendship and how their great father will bring peace and friendship to his Indian children. And I explore what those terms mean and how Indians have a completely different view of how this is going to work out and how actually What happens at Fort Clatsop is much more complicated, but I actually think it does have important lessons that Clark in particular brings back with him as governor of the Louisiana Territory and then later the Missouri Territory. And he really does try to protect Indian rights in ways that other American emissaries don't, at least initially. But even Clark's efforts, I think, are undermined by the forces of democracy, or in particular by the forces of white man's democracy. Here's demography as destiny. That Clark, in fact, runs for governor when Missouri becomes a state. We think of Missouri entering the Union principally as precipitating the Missouri crisis about statehood and whether slavery would be allowed or not allowed in the new territory when it becomes a state. In fact, locally, the conflict was much more about Indian rights, because Clark and his opponent both were ardent supporters of slavery. But Clark was seen as being, quote, too good to Indians. And that ultimately he runs, or he stands for election, and he loses by more than 2-1. And after that, Clark largely abandons, he continues to voice protection for Indian peoples in Missouri, but he increasingly moves to become the architect of removals, including that of the Shawnees and other Indian peoples from the lands in which they had lived in Missouri. Again, I'm running through all of these lessons very, very quickly. And then I would just two more here quickly. One, looking at the Oregon Trail experience, and particularly looking at Chimney Rock as a signal point on the Oregon Trail. And we were talking at lunch, and I'm here fascinated by the ways in which and I asked, I think, at the 3 o'clock meeting, how many of the students in the room had played the Oregon Trail computer game. And we have a slightly different age here this evening, but I'll ask, how many of you played the Oregon Trail computer game? Okay, so again, people under a certain age, but there's actually quite a bit of truth to that Oregon Trail computer game beyond just the knowledge of how to die of dysentery along the way. And in particular about, especially in later editions of the game, about the relations between Indians and European pioneers on the trail. And there, I think, lessons again about balances of numbers, about how that sort of, at least as long as pioneers are just passing through Indian countries, trading relations dominate. And there's really quite little, very, very contrary to our notion, the cinematic image, the circle the wagons image, which is the predominant cinematic staple, that, other than keeping their cattle in or something, that's not what they had to do to fend off Indians who, for some reason or another in cinema, are always riding in circles around them. But in fact, I think through the 1840s, trading between Indians and pioneers was the more typical relationship. It's only in the 1850s, as the numbers of Americans expand on the trails, as the US Army becomes more prominent on the trails, and as Americans then begin to settle on the plains, that those relations really shift from what had been mostly amicable and peaceful relations to ones that are much more violent, the ones we associate with the Plains Indian Wars of the 1870s, 1860s and 1870s. And finally, then, I come to my last chapter, probably the most unlikely place to include in a book about peace and friendship, and that is Dodge City, Kansas, known well to people here for being at the other end of the trail coming from these parts. And of course, Dodge City in American mythology is what we associate with the westest west. I mean, with the West at its wildest. It's the wildest West. It's the most violent West. It's the place, the phrase that still attaches to it is it's the place to get the hell out of, is still the way I think it's meant. And Dodge City remains not only an American myth, but an American metaphor, as a metaphor for the most violent, the most lawless, the most deadly places in the West, including what happened to Indian peoples in and around there. And the story about what happened to Indian peoples around there certainly affirms that vision. But I would argue that Dodge City has gotten something of a bad rap. That first, it was relatively less violent than many, many, many other parts of the West in this era. And that also, from a point of view of race relations, both on the trail and in town, I would argue in particular, for example, that blacks lived better on the trail and in Dodge City than they did in most other places in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s. And I would argue that, to invoke a contemporary phrase, that Black lives mattered more in Dodge City than they did almost anywhere else in the United States. And that's certainly in sharp contrast to the myth of Dodge City and the metaphor of Dodge City. And I try to understand some of why that happened. And I think there, and you take what lessons you want from that. One was that Dodge City tried to enforce one kind, that they disarmed people, at least on one part of town. And they also, and here it was a policing mechanism that was inviting all sorts of corruption. That is basically fee-based law and order, fee-based lawmaking, which was basically policemen got paid for arresting people rather than shooting them. And in that sense, that too, the don't shoot first lesson sort of had an impact on keeping violence in Dodge City relatively lower. Anyway, that's a very quick run through of the book's table of contents of some of the lessons. What I would say by way of quick conclusion here, the lessons of this book for us. From the last chapter, the one on Dodge City, might be that incentivizing police not to shoot first, disarming especially drunken men before they drink and gamble can save lives. Enforcement, however, was uneven, and it doesn't really allow us to sort of see how it fully worked out. And in that sense, history here and in other places doesn't make for the kind of perfect laboratory that we might want in sort of terms of taking away these lessons. In fact, that's, I think, the case for the instructions from across my alternative history. Much as we might wish for a historical how-to guide for how we might overcome our differences, the past is not so prescriptive. Lacking the freedom of alternate history, we can't swap out one fact or switch out one factor. Nor can we wave a magic wand and will different outcomes or isolate one particular cause or one true cause. The episodes that I chronicle and dissect in Peace and Friendship don't necessarily yield lessons that are readily applied anywhere and any time. Still, I would argue there's much we can learn from examples of unstable common ground, though the directions from my history, from my alternative history, can be controversial, can be contradictory, and are also contingent. In Dodge City, the actions by agents of the state reduced violence. By contrast, I would argue the opposite was true elsewhere. At Chillicothe, Apple Creek, to some extent Clatsop and Chimney Rock, the interventions of nations and empires upset local containments and upped the levels of violence. Nowhere in my alternative history can we find a record of continuous concord. Even as foes forgot, or at least sometimes, even as foes forgot or at least put aside for a time past enmities, differences were never permanently overcome. The legacy of broken concord on American frontiers from the Ohio Valley to the Pacific Coast and through the first century of the United States underscores instead how ephemeral were understandings between peoples and across cultures. No doubt these collapses frustrate those seeking a sure, straight path to lasting harmony. Seeing the demise of alternative relations only as dead ends, though, is too dark a view. From this alternative, we should not shortchange, from this alternative history, from this set of alternative moments, we should not shortchange the existence, and in some cases, the persistence of hospitable and inclusive cohabitations, even if these did give way. So too should we remember the imperfect arrangements that forestalled violence for a while. Commemorating compromises that were compromised means accepting that the legacies of concord are not all we might wish for, but better broken concord than no concord, and better to continue to seek out places and periods where peoples once, and not just once upon a time, overcame differences. For there too, we might find our way to peace and friendship. Thank you.